My husband punched me at his promotion party. The music stopped, but no one moved. His mother stood up and said, "Only God can save you now." His sister smirked. His father looked away. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I wiped the blood from my mouth and made one call. When they arrived, every single one of them went silent. The promotion party was supposed to be about his success, but from the moment we walked in, I knew it wasn't really about him. It was about power. His family had chosen the venue, approved the guest list, and positioned themselves like judges presiding over a ceremony they believed they owned. I stood beside my husband, smiling politely, already feeling like an accessory rather than a partner. He was tense before anything happened. I could feel it in the way his hand pressed too hard against my lower back, the way he answered questions without looking at me, the way his jaw tightened whenever someone congratulated me for supporting him so well. Support had always been my role. Silent, grateful, invisible. The punch came without warning. One moment, I was answering a harmless question from colleague's wife. The next, his fist collided with my face so hard my vision blurred. The sound wasn't sharp like in movies. It was dull, final, and humiliatingly loud. I stumbled backward into a table, glasses crashing to the floor as people froze mid-laugh. No one rushed toward me. That silence hurt more than the blow. I tasted blood and steadied myself against the table, waiting for someone to say something. Anyone. But his family didn't look shocked. They looked annoyed, as if I had disrupted the evening. His mother rose slowly from her chair. Smoothing her dress like this was an inconvenience. "Only God can save you now," she said calmly. Her words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were meant to corner me, to remind me that I was alone in that room. His sister nodded in agreement. His father crossed his arms and stared at the floor. Not one of them asked if I was hurt. My husband laughed under his breath. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I'd spent years absorbing comments, insults, and silent warnings to keep peace. Years convincing myself that endurance was strength. But standing there bleeding while they watched made one thing painfully clear. They weren't shocked because this wasn't new to them. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't look at them for permission. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. My husband tilted his head, amused. "Who are you calling?" he sneered. "Your parents? Your friends?" "No," I said quietly, meeting his eyes. "Someone who doesn't answer to you." The call connected almost immediately. Around us, whispers started, but the confidence in the room was still thick. His family believed I was bluffing. They believed I would back down once the attention turned uncomfortable. That belief had protected them for years. It failed them now. When the doors opened minutes later, the air shifted. Two uniformed officers entered first, followed by a woman holding a badge. Conversations died instantly. The music was cut. Glasses were set down without a sound. His mother's face drained of color. "Who called?" one officer asked. "I did," I said, stepping forward. The word assault left my mouth cleanly. I didn't soften it. I didn't explain it away. I stated it like a fact, because that's what it was. The officers separated us while witnesses were asked to speak. My husband tried to joke, then tried to argue, then went quiet when he was told to stop talking. One by one, people confirmed what they saw. His family said nothing. For the first time that night, I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't apologizing for making things difficult. I stood still while the illusion they relied on cracked in front of everyone they cared about. When they asked if I wanted to press charges, I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said. That single word ended their control. The flashing lights outside the venue painted the walls in slow pulses of red and blue. It felt unreal, like the party had slipped into a different dimension where consequences actually existed. Guests avoided eye contact as officers moved through the room, collecting statements, documenting the broken glass, photographing my swollen lip. People who had laughed with his family minutes earlier now stood stiff and uncomfortable, suddenly aware that silence had made them complicit. And my husband sat several feet away, shoulders hunched, his confidence drained as quickly as it had appeared. He tried once more to speak, to explain, to soften what had happened with tone and familiarity, but he was shut down again. Watching that happen was jarring. I had never seen anyone interrupt him before. Not his parents. Not his siblings. Not even me. His mother hovered nearby, her face tight, eyes darting as if searching for someone to rescue the situation. The certainty she had displayed earlier was gone. She attempted to step toward one of the officers, but was calmly instructed to remain where she was. The humiliation on her face was unmistakable. Authority had entered the room, and it wasn't hers. When the officers asked if I needed medical attention, I nodded. Only then did I realize how much pain I was actually in. Shock has a way of numbing everything except awareness. As they gently examined my face, I felt the room watching again, but this time, not with judgment, with discomfort, with fear of association. Witnesses were asked to step forward. At first, no one moved. Then a woman from his workplace raised her hand, her voice shaking as she described exactly what she had seen. Another followed, then another. Each statement peeled away another layer of protection his family had relied on for years. Their silence no longer mattered. The truth was louder. His father finally spoke, attempting to frame it as stress, alcohol, pressure. The officer listened politely, then asked one simple question. "Did you see him, Stryker?" There was a pause. "Yes," his father said quietly. That answer landed harder than any punch. My husband looked up at him, stunned, betrayed. It was the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of me, but fear of losing the shield his family had always provided. That shield was cracking in real time. When the officers told him he would be escorted out for further questioning, his mother finally broke. "This is unnecessary," she snapped. "You're destroying his future." The officer turned to her calmly. "Ma'am, his actions are responsible for that." I felt a strange sense of detachment as I watched them lead him toward the exit. Not triumph, not vengeance, just clarity. The man being escorted away wasn't a mystery anymore. He was exactly who his behavior said he was. Outside, the night air was cold against my skin. The noise of the city continued around us, indifferent to the unraveling happening on the sidewalk. I gave my statement again, clearly and without emotion. Dates, facts, words spoken, actions taken. The officer nodded as he typed, not rushing me, not interrupting. When it was over, he asked me a question no one in that family ever had. "Do you feel safe going home tonight?" The answer came immediately. No. They arranged transport. As I sat in the back seat of the patrol car, I watched the venue disappear behind us. The party lights were still on. The decorations still hung. But whatever image that family had worked so hard to maintain had collapsed beyond repair. My phone buzzed with messages I didn't open. I already knew what they would say. Damage control, appeals to faith, appeals to forgiveness, appeals to silence. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. For the first time that night, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. I was relieved that it finally would. I didn't ask where they were taking me. I didn't need to. Anywhere was better than the house that still smelled like his cologne and his mother's incense. The place where silence had been trained into me like a reflex. The car moved steadily through the city, the officer driving without small talk, giving me space to exist without explanation. That was new. At some point, my phone stopped buzzing. Either they had finally realized I wasn't responding, or they were regrouping. Both possibilities felt distant, irrelevant. What mattered was the quiet inside the car, the steady rhythm of movement, the strange feeling of having survived something irreversible. When I arrived, the officer walked me to the door and waited until I was safely inside. He didn't rush. He didn't act like this was routine. That simple respect cracked something open in me. I thanked him, my voice hoarse, and he nodded before leaving without asking anything more of me. Inside, the lights were low. I set my bag down and stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. My reflection in the mirror startled me. The swelling, the redness, the mark that made everything undeniable. I touched my lip gently, then pulled my hand away. I wasn't shocked by how he had hit me. I was shocked by how long I had been preparing for it without knowing that I sat on the edge of the bed and let the night catch up to me. My hand shook. My stomach turned. The delayed fear finally arrived, heavy and insistent. But it didn't pull me under. It passed through me like a wave and receded, leaving clarity behind. I checked my phone then just once. Dozens of messages. Missed calls. His sister accusing me of ruining everything. His cousin urging me to be reasonable. His mother's message was the calmest of all. You've gone too far. Come back. We'll talk. Talk. That word had been used to erase too much. I turned the phone face down. Sleep came in fragments. Images surfaced uninvited. The punch, the silence, the words. Only God can save you. Each time I woke, my body expected danger. Each time, there was none. That contrast slowly rewired something in me. By morning, exhaustion replaced fear. The kind that comes after adrenaline drains and reality settles in. I showered carefully, wincing as water touched the bruise. I dressed without thinking about what anyone else might say. That alone felt revolutionary. The first call I made wasn't to my family. It was to a lawyer. I didn't explain emotionally. I didn't embellish. I stated facts. The lawyer listened, asked precise questions, and told me what steps to take next. Her tone was calm, practiced. It grounded me. After that, I made another call to my workplace. I told them I wouldn't be in. I didn't explain why. I didn't apologize. I simply stated it. No one pushed back. That afternoon, I sat by a window and watched people move through their lives. Ordinary moments unfolding while mine had split cleanly into before and after. I felt detached, but alert, like someone standing on solid ground after surviving a fall. The realization came slowly, but when it did, it was unmistakable. I wasn't running. I was choosing. That distinction mattered more than anything else. They would frame this however they wanted. They would pray, justify, blame, minimize. They would look for a way to restore their version of order. But I was no longer part of that system. And for the first time in years, I felt something dangerously close to peace. WY the next morning, the story had already begun to shift, quietly, subtly, in ways they couldn't control. I learned later that while I was sitting by that window, his family was scrambling. Phones were ringing. Relatives were being looped in. Explanations were being drafted and redrafted, each version trying to preserve the same core idea. This was unfortunate but manageable. Private. Fixable. They were wrong. What they didn't understand was that once witnesses speak, a story no longer belongs to the people who created it. It belongs to everyone who saw it. I met my lawyer in the early afternoon. She was direct, methodical, and unmoved by emotional spin. She asked about the history, arguments, control, patterns. I didn't realize how much I had normalized until I heard myself listing things I had once dismissed as just how he is or how his family operates. She stopped me at one point. "That isn't normal," she said calmly. The sentence landed harder than anything else that day. Normal had been my cage. It had taught me to minimize, to reinterpret harm as misunderstanding, to see aggression as stress. Hearing someone dismantle that framework so simply was like watching a wall fall down. While we talked, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail from her mother. Her voice was steady, almost kind. "You're making a mistake," she said. "People are talking. You're damaging everyone involved, including yourself." I listened all the way through. Then I deleted it. For the first time, I understood that shame had always been their sharpest weapon. Not violence, not faith. Shame. The fear of being seen, judged, excluded. The belief that exposure was worse than harm. That belief no longer had power over me. Later that evening, I received confirmation that my husband had been formally charged. The language was precise, unemotional, impossible to twist. The moment I read it, I felt something release in my chest. Not relief exactly, validation. This was real. This mattered. And it wasn't going away. Friends began to reach out. Some cautiously, some directly. A few admitted they had seen concerning behavior before but hadn't known how to intervene. Their honesty didn't anger me. It clarified something important. Silence thrives in uncertainty. Once certainty appears, people find their courage. His workplace followed soon after. An HR inquiry. A request for statements. The party, which had been meant to elevate him, now anchored him to a moment he couldn't escape. I imagined his family watching this unfold, realizing too late that intimidation only works in private, that invoking God doesn't silence law. That unity fractures the moment accountability enters the room. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. Not because everything was resolved, but because everything was real. They could no longer pretend nothing had happened. And neither could I. The shift didn't happen loudly. There was no dramatic announcement, no public reckoning that played out in front of cameras. Instead, it unfolded in private spaces, phone calls that went unanswered, doors that stayed closed, people who suddenly became unavailable. That's how power really dissolves. Not with explosions, but with distance. I felt it first in the silence. His family stopped calling me directly. Not because they respected my boundaries, but because they had been advised not to. Their messages began traveling through other people, relatives I barely knew, old family friends, anyone who could plausibly claim neutrality. Each message followed the same pattern, concern disguised as caution. This is getting serious. You don't want this to spiral. Think about forgiveness. Forgiveness. Always forgiveness. Never accountability. What they didn't understand was that forgiveness is a personal process, not a legal strategy, and it cannot be weaponized to erase harm. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I changed routines. I secured my documents. I made sure I wasn't alone when I didn't want to be. Each small decision reinforced something inside me that had been fragile for too long, my sense of authority over my own life. The first court-related meeting came sooner than I expected. Sitting in that room, listening to formal language describe something so intimate and violent felt surreal. But it also stripped the event of its emotional fog. What had happened wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't provocation. It wasn't stress. It was violence. Hearing it named that way changed everything. His defense began quietly. Statements about character, about pressure, about how out of character the incident was. But character doesn't exist in isolation. It reveals itself in moments like that party, when people are watching, when power is challenged, when control slips. Witness statements mattered. Medical records mattered. The fact that his family had said what they said, only God can save you, mattered more than they realized. It showed intent, isolation, a belief that faith could override consequence. That belief didn't hold up under scrutiny. Meanwhile, my life continued in ways I hadn't expected. I went to work. I met friends for coffee. I laughed, tentatively at first, then more freely. There was a strange guilt that came with that, like joy was something I hadn't earned. I had to unlearn that too. One evening, I ran into someone who had been at the party. She looked hesitant when she saw me, then relieved. "I'm glad you're okay," she said quietly. That night, it scared me. Her honesty mattered more than she knew. It reminded me that even when people don't intervene, they see. And once the truth is out, it lingers. That night, I thought again about his mother's words. How absolute they had sounded. How confident. How final. Only God can save you. What she hadn't accounted for was this. Belief systems crumble when exposed to reality. Prayer cannot undo witnesses. Faith cannot silence evidence. And intimidation has no power once fear leaves the room. They had challenged me, expecting submission. What they got instead was separation. And separation, I was learning, is where survival turns into freedom. The day came quietly, without warning. I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about them for several hours. Not my husband, not his mother, not the way their voices used to fill my head, even when they weren't present. The absence startled me more than the fear ever had. That was when I understood I was no longer tethered to them. For years, my emotional life had revolved around anticipation. What he might say, how his family might react, how to avoid triggering another explosion disguised as discipline or concern. Even after leaving, part of me had stayed vigilant, as if danger might still appear if I relaxed. But that morning, my body felt different. My shoulders weren't clenched. My jaw wasn't tight. I breathed deeply without forcing myself to. It was the first time I noticed how much of my energy had been spent bracing for impact. The legal process moved forward in the background, but it no longer dominated my thoughts. Updates came through my lawyer in clear, measured language. Each one reinforced the same reality. This was not a private matter. It was not something that could be prayed away or softened by family unity. And that terrified them. I learned they had begun avoiding certain social circles. Invitations declined. Appearances shortened. People who once praised their values now watched them more carefully. Violence has a way of exposing hypocrisy in ways sermons never can. My husband attempted to reach me once more through a carefully worded message sent by his attorney. It spoke of regret, counseling, pressure, misunderstanding. I read it slowly, then handed it to my lawyer without comment. I didn't need to respond. Silence, when chosen freely, is powerful. What struck me most was how quickly my sense of self began to return once their influence faded. I remembered things about myself I had forgotten, how decisive I could be, how observant, how strong my intuition had always been. None of that had disappeared. It had just been suppressed. I started making choices without consulting an imaginary panel of judges. What to wear, where to go, who to trust. Each decision, no matter how small, reinforced my independence. One afternoon, I caught myself smiling at my reflection. Not nervously, not performatively, just smiling. It felt unfamiliar and deeply right. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had believed fear would bind me to them forever. Instead, fear had sharpened my awareness. It had pushed me to act decisively, to step out of a structure that thrived on my compliance. They had told me only God could save me. But salvation didn't arrive from above. It arrived the moment I stopped waiting for permission to protect myself. As night fell, I sat alone with a sense of calm that felt earned. Not fragile, not temporary. Solid. Whatever came next, court dates, judgments, whispered opinions, I knew one thing with certainty. They no longer owned any part of me. And that knowledge was the beginning of a life that belonged entirely to me. That it didn't take long before I noticed a shift in them. Not through direct contact. There was none, but through the way the world around them began to react. People who once echoed their confidence now spoke cautiously. Conversations stopped when names were mentioned. Invitations dried up quietly. The certainty they had worn like armor at that party began to fracture under the weight of exposure. Fear changes people. I saw it in the way messages were phrased when they reached me indirectly. No more threats. No more spiritual superiority. Now, there were disclaimers, hesitations, words chosen carefully as if everything could be used against them, because it could. They were afraid of saying the wrong thing. That realization grounded me in a way nothing else had. For years, I had been the one walking on eggshells, measuring my tone, editing my reactions, absorbing cruelty so others could remain comfortable. Now the balance had shifted. They were the ones calculating consequences, watching their words, trying to predict outcomes. I didn't celebrate it. I observed it. One afternoon, my lawyer mentioned something almost casually. "They're being very careful now," she said. "Every move is cautious." Careful. That word had never applied to how they treated me. I thought back to the moment his mother stood up and spoke with such authority, convinced she was untouchable, convinced faith and family loyalty would override everything else. That certainty had evaporated. What remained was uncertainty, the kind that forces people to confront their lack of control. My days continued steadily. I returned to work. I focused on tasks that had nothing to do with survival or defense. I reconnected with parts of myself that had been dormant: curiosity, creativity, humor. The woman who existed before fear reclaimed space in my life. Sometimes I caught myself waiting for guilt to surface. It didn't, because guilt requires doubt, and I had none. I had done exactly what was necessary. I had responded to violence with clarity, not chaos. I had refused to be intimidated by religion, family hierarchy, or shame. I had chosen action over endurance. That choice insulated me. As weeks passed, I realized something else. Their fear wasn't about consequences alone. It was about exposure, about being seen clearly by people whose approval they valued, about losing the moral authority they had used to dominate others. They were no longer the family with answers. They were the family with questions, and I was no longer part of their equation. That understanding didn't make me bitter. It made me free. Free to move forward without dragging their fear, their guilt, or their attempts at control with me. They had challenged me, convinced I would be overwhelmed. Instead, I had outgrown them. And growth, unlike fear, doesn't ask for permission. There was a moment, somewhere between court dates and quiet evenings, when I realized I had been waiting for something without admitting it to myself. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, an apology, something that acknowledged the harm plainly, without excuses or faith wrapped around it like insulation. That apology never came. And when I accepted that it wouldn't, something unexpected happened. I felt lighter. I understood then that apologies from people who refuse accountability are rarely about remorse. They're about control, about resetting the balance without changing behavior. Waiting for one had kept me subtly tethered to them, as if closure depended on their recognition. It didn't. The truth was already complete without their participation. I stopped imagining conversations that would never happen. I stopped wondering what words might finally make them understand. Understanding was never the obstacle. Power was. And power doesn't relinquish itself through dialogue. It dissolves when it's no longer obeyed. That realization marked another quiet turning point. I began to plan for the future without referencing the past. Not as a reaction, not as a recovery exercise, but as a natural extension of who I was becoming. Decisions felt cleaner now. I trusted my judgment without cross-checking it against fear. When people asked how I was doing, I answered honestly. I'm steady, I said. Not healed, not broken. Steady. That steadiness became my anchor. I noticed how differently I occupied space. I spoke more slowly. I listened more carefully. I no longer rushed to fill silence. Silence had stopped feeling dangerous. It had become neutral, sometimes even restful. One evening, while organizing papers, I came across an old photo of us. A version of me smiled back, smaller, guarded, trying very hard to be agreeable. I didn't feel sadness. I felt compassion. That woman had survived with the tools she had. I had simply learned better once. I tore the photo in half and recycled it without ceremony. Not out of anger, out of finality. That night, I slept without dreams. The kind of sleep that comes when your mind no longer needs to rehearse defenses. When your body finally believes the threat has passed. The apology I once thought I needed was replaced by something far more solid. Self-respect. And once that took root, there was nothing left for them to give or take. They had challenged me, certain I would crumble. What they never understood was that silence, when it stops being fear, becomes freedom. And freedom doesn't wait for permission. It happened in an ordinary place, doing an ordinary thing. I was standing in line at a grocery store, holding a basket with a few things I actually wanted, not things chosen to avoid comments or judgment. The cashier smiled at me and asked how my day was going. Good, I said. The word came out naturally, without hesitation, without the familiar urge to soften it or qualify it. And that was when it hit me. I meant it. For years, my sense of self had been filtered through someone else's approval, through his moods, through his family's rules, through an unspoken expectation that my job was to absorb discomfort so others could feel righteous and undisturbed. I had learned to doubt my instincts because doubting myself kept the peace. Standing there, I realized that doubt was gone. I paid, stepped outside, and sat in my car for a moment, letting the realization settle. I wasn't rebuilding anymore. I wasn't proving anything. I was simply living, and that life no longer revolved around managing harm. That clarity followed me home. I noticed it in how I handled small things. A call I didn't want to take, I let it go to voicemail. An invitation that felt draining, I declined without explanation. A boundary that needed to be stated, I stated it once and didn't repeat myself. Nothing collapsed. The world didn't punish me for choosing myself. The legal process continued, but it had faded into the background where it belonged. It no longer felt like the center of my life, just one thread among many. When updates came, I acknowledged them calmly and moved on. I trusted the process without surrendering my peace to it. One afternoon, a friend asked me something gently, cautiously. Do you ever miss him? I considered the question honestly. I miss who I thought I was supposed to be with, I said. But I don't miss who I became trying to survive him. Saying it out loud felt like sealing a truth that had already taken root. I thought again about his family, about the certainty with which they had spoken that night, about how confident they were that fear and faith would keep me in place. They had mistaken endurance for weakness. They had confused silence with obedience. They had been wrong. I didn't leave because I was brave in some dramatic, cinematic way. I left because one moment finally outweighed years of conditioning. Because the cost of staying became greater than the fear of leaving. That's how change really happens. Not all at once, not loudly, but decisively. As evening settled in, I cooked dinner in my own space, moved freely through my home, and sat down to eat without tension coiled in my chest. The quiet felt honest, earned. For the first time, I wasn't asking myself how to survive the next day. I was thinking about what I wanted to build. And that was the clear sign of all that their power over me was truly gone. The realization didn't arrive with anger or triumph. It arrived with calm certainty, the kind that settles in your bones and doesn't ask for reassurance. I was no longer in danger of being pulled back, emotionally, psychologically, or socially. Whatever ties had once bound me to that family had dissolved completely. I noticed it when I stopped wondering what they were saying about me. For a long time, that curiosity had lingered, not because I wanted approval, but because I had been trained to monitor perception, to stay ahead of judgment. That instinct had kept me trapped longer than I liked to admit. But now it was gone. Their opinions had become irrelevant, like noise from a distant room I no longer occupied. That was freedom in its truest form. I realized how often I had mistaken familiarity for safety. How many times I had stayed because leaving felt like failure, like betrayal, like breaking a rule I had never agreed to but felt obligated to follow. Those beliefs had kept me compliant. Leaving had shattered them. One afternoon, I received a message from someone I hadn't heard from in months, a relative on his side who had once been vocal about keeping the family together. The message was short, cautious. I hope you're doing well. No advice. No pressure. No moral lesson. I didn't respond, not out of resentment, but because I didn't need to. That chapter had closed. Any bridge that once existed had been burned the moment violence was excused and faith was used as a threat. I turned my attention fully to my own life. I made plans that extended months into the future without factoring in potential conflict. I invested time in friendships that felt mutual rather than conditional. I chose peace not as a reward, but as a standard. I noticed something else too. My confidence no longer came from resistance. I wasn't strong because I was fighting. I was strong because I wasn't. I had removed myself from the battlefield entirely. That distinction mattered. There was nothing left to prove. No point left to make. Anyone who still didn't understand never would, and that no longer concerned me. I had stopped carrying the burden of other people's denial. Late one evening, I reflected on that night at the party. The punch, the silence, the challenge. It no longer triggered fear or rage. It felt distant, like a memory from another life. A turning point, yes, but not a wound. I understood now that walking away had been the most powerful act of my life. Not because it punished anyone, but because it protected me. They once believed they could corner me with intimidation and faith. What they learned, slowly and painfully, was that once a woman decides her life is worth more than obedience, there is nothing left that can hold her, and nothing that can bring her back. What surprised me most wasn't how much lighter I felt. It was how normal that lightness eventually became. At first, peace felt fragile, like something I might accidentally break if I moved too quickly. I treated it carefully, cautiously, as if waiting for someone to snatch it away. But no one did. Days passed, then weeks, and nothing collapsed. I learned that fear, once it leaves, doesn't come back unless you invite it. It has no power on its own. It survives on permission, on habit, on the belief that danger is inevitable. Once I stopped believing that, fear had nothing left to do. I noticed how my body changed first. My breathing deepened. My posture shifted. I no longer scanned rooms unconsciously, no longer measured people's moods before speaking. My laughter came easier, fuller, without the reflex to check whether it was allowed. I was no longer performing safety. I was living it. People began to comment on the change. You seem different, they said. Calmer, stronger. I didn't correct them or explain. Growth doesn't need justification. It speaks for itself in the way you move, the way you listen, the way you refuse to be rushed or diminished. The legal process reached its natural conclusions in time. Paperwork finalized. Boundaries made permanent. Outcomes delivered without drama. I received the information, acknowledged it, and closed the folder, literally and mentally. The system had done what it needed to do, but the real work had already been done inside me. I no longer flinched at raised voices. I no longer associated love with endurance or loyalty with silence. I had learned to distinguish between people who protect and people who control. And once you see that difference, you can't unsee it. One evening, I sat alone and thought about the woman I had been at that party. Bleeding, surrounded, challenged, told she could only be saved by something outside herself. I felt no shame toward her, only respect. She had made one decision that changed everything. She had spoken, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. And clarity, I learned, is unstoppable. I didn't rebuild my life in opposition to them. I rebuilt it in alignment with myself. That difference is everything. One is exhausting. The other is sustainable. I stopped calling what I had survived trauma and started calling it information. Information about boundaries, about danger, about my own capacity, information that would protect me for the rest of my life. They once believed fear would keep me obedient. What they never anticipated was that fear would educate me instead. And once fear finishes teaching you, it quietly steps aside because it's no longer needed. That's when life truly begins. By the time I realized how far I had come, the change was already complete. Peace had stopped feeling like a fragile state I needed to defend and started feeling like the natural condition of my life. I didn't guard it anxiously anymore. I trusted it. And more importantly, I trusted myself to protect it if I ever had to again. My days no longer revolved around reaction. I woke up without bracing for impact. I planned my weeks without leaving space for emergencies that never should have been mine to manage. I noticed how much of my energy had once been consumed by anticipating other people's behavior. Now, that energy belonged to me. I used it well. I began doing things simply because they felt right. I rearranged my space. I changed routines. I traveled alone without checking in with anyone for approval. Every small act reinforced a truth that had once felt dangerous to acknowledge. My life did not require permission. There were moments when the past surfaced unexpectedly. A phrase, a tone of voice, a sudden memory of that night. But those moments no longer pulled me backward. They passed through me like weather, noticed, acknowledged, and gone. I didn't cling to them or fight them. I had learned that resistance gives power, while acceptance releases it. Occasionally, someone would ask if I was angry. I wasn't. Anger had done its job. It had alerted me to danger. It had pushed me to act. Once I was safe, it faded naturally. What replaced it was something quieter and far more durable: self-trust. That trust became my compass. When something felt wrong, I listened. When something felt right, I moved toward it without hesitation. I no longer negotiated with discomfort or tried to reframe it into something acceptable. I honored it. I thought again about the words that had once been thrown at me like a curse. Only God can save you. They had been meant to strip me of agency, to make me feel small and dependent. But time had transformed those words into something else entirely. They reminded me that I had saved myself, not through force, not through revenge, but through clarity, courage, and a refusal to remain silent. That realization anchored me in a way nothing else ever had. It wasn't something that could be shaken by opinion or circumstance. It lived inside me, steady and unmovable. As night fell, I sat in my home, surrounded by quiet that felt honest and safe. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not justice, not validation, not understanding. Everything I needed was already present. The past no longer defined me. The future no longer frightened me. And the life I was living now belonged entirely to me. Untouched, unclaimed, and finally free. Strength didn't arrive as something loud or dramatic. It didn't feel like victory, and it certainly didn't feel like revenge. It settled into me slowly, quietly, until one day I realized it was simply there, part of how I stood, how I spoke, how I moved through the world. I noticed it in ordinary moments. When someone interrupted me, I calmly finished my sentence. When someone dismissed my opinion, I didn't rush to defend it. When something didn't feel right, I walked away without explanation. None of these actions felt heroic. They felt natural. That was the difference. For years, I had believed strength meant enduring pain without complaint. That belief had been reinforced by everyone around me, by family, by culture, by faith twisted into obedience. But real strength, I learned, isn't about endurance. It's about discernment, knowing when to stay and when to leave, knowing when silence protects you and when it destroys you. The night of the promotion party replayed in my mind one last time, not as a wound, but as a reference point. I remembered the certainty in their voices, the way they had closed ranks, the confidence with which they believed fear would paralyze me. That moment now felt almost surreal, like a scene from a life I once lived but no longer recognized. They had underestimated something fundamental. They thought my calm was weakness. They thought my patience was submission. They thought my silence was obedience. They were wrong on all counts. What they couldn't see was that I had been paying attention for a long time. That every moment of endurance had been a lesson, every dismissal a data point. The punch hadn't created my strength. It had revealed it. I began to trust myself in ways I never had before. Not just in moments of crisis, but in everyday decisions. I stopped second-guessing my reactions. I stopped seeking reassurance for instincts that had always been accurate. That trust became my anchor. People around me felt the shift. Some admired it. Some felt unsettled by it. Strength has a way of doing that. It doesn't ask for approval, and it doesn't soften itself to be liked. I didn't explain my boundaries anymore. I simply enforced them. I didn't tell my story to convince. I told it when it mattered, and I withheld it when it didn't. I understood now that access to me was a privilege, not a right. Late one evening, as I sat alone with a cup of tea, I reflected on the version of myself that once believed survival required shrinking. That woman had done the best she could with what she knew. I honored her, but I didn't live as her anymore. I lived as someone who knew her worth without needing it affirmed. Someone who recognized danger without minimizing it. Someone who understood that courage isn't loud, it's precise. They had challenged me, certain that fear would define the outcome. What they never understood was that fear had already taught me everything I needed to know. And once its lesson was learned, it had no further purpose in my life that by the time everything truly ended, nothing dramatic marked the moment. There was no final confrontation, no emotional speech, no symbolic closing of a door. Life simply moved forward, quietly, steadily, without consulting the people who once believed they had authority over it. And that was the most powerful ending of all. I realized that I no longer measure my progress by how far I had come from them, but by how close I felt to myself. My days were no longer shaped by reaction or recovery. They were shaped by intention. What I wanted, what I valued, what I refused to tolerate. The past became something I could carry without it weighing me down. I no longer felt the need to explain what had happened. Those who needed to understand already did. Those who didn't were never going to, and that truth no longer troubled me. I had learned that clarity doesn't come from convincing others. It comes from standing firmly in your own reality. There were moments when I caught glimpses of my old life. Familiar places, familiar faces, familiar dynamics playing out without me. And instead of longing or anger, I felt distance. Healthy, irreversible distance. Like watching a storm from behind thick glass, aware of its force but untouched by it. I thought about how easily they had spoken that night, how confidently they had challenged me, how certain they were that I would be crushed by isolation, shame, and fear. They had mistaken my humanity for fragility. They had confused kindness with weakness. They never imagined I would choose myself so completely that I didn't become harder. I became clearer. I didn't lose my compassion. I redirected it inward, where it had always belonged. I didn't stop believing in faith. I stopped allowing it to be used as a weapon against me. The life I built afterward wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about winning. It was about living without apology, without fear, without permission. That was the real transformation. I didn't need to be saved. I needed one moment of truth, one decision made without compromise, one refusal to accept silence as my fate. Everything that followed was simply the natural consequence of that choice. And that life, quiet, strong, self-owned, is the one I continue to live now. I didn't walk away to be brave. I walked away because staying would have meant disappearing. They believed fear, faith, and family would keep me in place. What they never understood was this. The moment I chose myself, their power ended. I didn't need saving. I needed one clear decision. And once I made it, my life continued, untouched by their permission and finally my own.